because as I'll talk about, there's a lot of hype surrounding this, and I think we need to treat that hype with a lot of caution, but not fall into the trap of assuming that because powerful economic interests are pushing this as an agenda, that there's therefore nothing happening here. And hopefully I'm going to be able to walk that line effectively. And a way to start is simply to try and very tightly define what it is we're talking about. And so it's a term that has become prominent very quickly. And like many terms that become prominent at that speed, it is quite capacious. It does a lot of discursive work. And in the kind of more technical literature, people will talk about machine learning, deep learning, large language models. And artificial intelligence is in part, I think, a marketing term. It's a term that's used to win attention. It's a term that's used to sell products. And it's a term that's used to make a case for funding. But I think it is a useful term in this case, nonetheless, because generative artificial intelligence is a way of making sense of a range of products and services that are already starting to meet consumers. And I think will continue to do so over time. And as a digital sociologist, this is what really interests me. So someone from my position doesn't want to black box the technology. We want to understand how it works in social contexts. But particularly if someone working in my side of the tradition as a micro-sociologist of the digital, I'm interested in what happens when end users meet technology in the real world, how they understand it, the meaning it has for them, what they do with it. And so the way I want to approach generative AI is as a mundane system that will become familiar very rapidly in everyday life. And our imagination of this has been dominated by ChatGPT because of its immense success at winning attention and visibility. But I'm going to explain how this is a much broader category of software with a common or more or less common underlying technology. And it's important to say at the outset that in spite of the term artificial intelligence, this isn't, I would argue, meaningfully intelligent or autonomous. It's being compared often to autocomplete on steroids, autocomplete on a vast scale. And as I'll explain, some of these systems have been around in more primitive forms for at least a decade. And what's changed is the computing capacity, training data, and the learning techniques, which enable the underlying technology to be leveraged in newly effective ways. And to give an example of why people find this so enticing, I asked ChatGPT to generate a poem about generative AI and its impact on universities in the style of Dr. Seuss. And so things like this are superficially impressive. I think it is indeed in the style of Dr. Seuss, and there's some parts of it that are quite delightful. Is it about a new creation, a blessing or a curse? A generative AI had spawned an intellectual spree. Leaving aside the question of what on earth an intellectual spree is, it does what it claims to do, in the sense that it manipulates existing forms and can slot new types of content into it. And in this sense, it's not at all new. So what was called robo-journalism has been around for at least 10 years. And these companies started by writing sports stories and business stories, precisely because the form was so familiar. So if you think about a news story about a sports game, you know, Team A beat Team B by X number of goals, you know, meaningful event Y and Z happened. If you think about a business story, a particular stock is going up or down in value, leading to an executive from that firm to make a comment or an external commentator. So the capacity to write stories automatically has been around for at least a decade in a very sophisticated form. A surprising but still unknown amount of journalism is actually already written by systems and has been for some time. And what's changed is the expansion of the genres that we can write in this way, and also the fact that end users have access to it. So it's less about a technological innovation and more, I'd argue, to do with the dissemination of the technology, its diffusion and circulation throughout society. And the excitement that comes because ChatGPT has been designed to encourage people to screenshot these outputs, and to share them online through social media. And that sense of generative AI as a marketing exercise, I think, has not received as much analytical attention as it should. But their success in publicizing this has led to less attention being given to other forms of generative AI than I think should be the case. So these are two recent images that circulated internationally, both generated by AI systems. One of Trump grappling with New York police, I found instantly obvious as a fake, simply because there's so much apparatus around him and so many consequences to something like this happening that it just seems like it wouldn't happen. You know, it's spectacular, but spectacular in an implausible way. Whereas the image of the Pope in this quite impressive white buffer coat, I did on first sight think, you know, I didn't notice it as obviously fake. And it's the second or third time I saw the image that I started to wonder, has this been generated by an AI system? And we're in the very early stages of these systems being used and immediately diffused through social media. And what's worrying about that is that the turmoil at social media firms is such that they are less able than ever to respond to what is likely to be a torrent of misinformation and artificially generated images. We see the same thing with video. So the first Republican attack advert generated by AI was released a couple of weeks ago. There was an accusation that a video was used, generated by AI, to smear the opposition leader in the current Turkish election. And so I'd suggest that the capacity to generate images and generate videos through prompting these systems is likely in the short term to be much more consequential than something like ChatGPT. But there are lots of other applications as well. So the automatic generation of computer code. Experienced programmers work with these systems to support them working more effectively, to debug software more quickly. But there are low-level forms of coding which are likely to be rendered redundant by the capacity of these systems to do this. Voice imitation is uncanny and slightly terrifying. So Microsoft's research team released examples of how they could imitate the voice of famous people from very small segments of recorded audio. Paraphrasing engines is how the DTCE team got drawn into this topic in the first place. And we suspect that this is already widespread amongst our students. So you put text into the software and it will generate a complete original paraphrase of it for you. Automatic course generators, their outputs are slightly dubious, I've been told, but you know, it nonetheless poses a potential challenge for academics and academia. Drafting presentations, and particularly emphasis on drafting them, I think is quite exciting. So as someone who, say, writes a lot of blog posts, if I'm doing a talk based on a blog post, I could ask the system to produce a first draft of a presentation that I then customize. And PowerPoint Designer, which I realized when writing this talk that I've come to over-rely on in the last year, is a really mundane example of generative AI that has become familiar to many of us. And so there's a range of applications, some already here, others coming very soon, and the consequences of each of them are likely to be quite different. Turning back to ChatGPT, though, as the one that has received the most immediate attention, I think it's important that we recognize the existing limitations of these systems. And some people argue that these limitations are temporary obstacles. I'm less convinced by that because I think some of these are inherent in the nature of the technology itself. The first is the tendency towards what's called hallucination. So when ChatGPT produces plausible but factually incorrect claims in response to user prompts. So some people argue this is a consequence of user failure. So if you fail to provide an adequate context when you ask ChatGPT to do something, it will not offer you a response which is relevant to the context of your question. Another claim is that this reflects the kind of uncertain data quality that has been fed into the system. So what you put in affects what comes out. But ultimately, my understanding is that the technology itself is opaque, because we know what goes into neural networks, we know what comes out of them, but exactly what's going on in between is still uncertain. And in a more practical, mundane sense, the problem, I think, is not necessarily the hallucination itself, but the fact that we don't know when it's hallucinating. So to fact check ChatGPT, you already have to have knowledge in that domain. But if you have knowledge in that domain, you're probably not that likely to ask factual questions of it in the first place. So there's a tendency toward, there's an epistemic risk built into the system and how it will tend to be used, which is worrying, particularly if we get to a point where people are treating this as an immediately authoritative source, or even just a prima facie authoritative source. A related but distinct problem is what's been called the Snow White problem. So it's widely believed that Disney's Snow White was the first animated film. In reality, it wasn't. It was the second animated film. But because it's widely believed it was the first, if you ask ChatGPT, what's the first animated film, it will say Disney's Snow White. And this points to a problem that it's relying upon consensus. So there's no adjudication of accuracy or fact. It's inferring from its training data about what is and is not the case. And it's presenting answers to people by making probabilistic judgments about what they expect to receive in response to their prompts. And so again, we have a fact-checking problem. And something like Wikipedia, for all its limitations, it has a deliberative mechanism built into it. If you look at the discussion tab for any Wikipedia page, you can see the human claim and counterclaim, the debate and discussion that goes in to adjudicating what ends up on a Wikipedia page. And we don't have that with ChatGPT. Microsoft Bing's application is slightly better because it shows the sources involved, but it's still something of a problem. The third limitation is one I was hesitant about including because I think it's a complex and troubling issue that needs to be treated comprehensively. But I wanted to highlight this very disturbing case as an example of what we might see more of if there are vulnerabilities and propensities to be harmed by interactions with quasi-autonomous agents in the population. Then loosing this technology at the speed it's being loosed at and in the way it's being done could be potentially very harmful. The extent to which it can feel like we're interacting with an intelligent agent is psychologically very loaded. And I think we need to think very carefully about the unintentional harms that are opened up by that, particularly as I'll come on to what that means for us as a university. And so going to the university, a lot of the discussion so far has focused on assessment. And I think that's entirely understandable because there are core assumptions underlying assessment that are, if not falsified, challenged or problematized by generative AI. And I think one of the tensions in the current debate is between the short-term concern for assessment integrity and a medium or long-term recognition that we're unlikely to be able to hold back this tide. And even if we could, it's probably not a good thing for our students, given they'll be working in an environment where this technology is ubiquitous. And so we need to think about what we're assessing for under these conditions and the kinds of skills and competencies of working with generative AI systems, which are going to be relevant already and will become more so with time. So if you're working with a system, then you're still prompting it, you're interpreting it, and you're synthesizing the outputs in purposive ways. And we need to think about not just what counts as malpractice within this system and to revisit that from first principles, but what we should be assessing for as we reform assessment in a changing socio-technical climate. And that poses lots of fairly deep challenges about governance, deliberation, policymaking in universities as they currently exist. And so when I say forecasts, I mean that as a much weaker claim than predictions. But what I'm trying to do at this stage is to identify what I see as the salient tendencies for what generative AI means for universities, and then to begin to think about where these trends might be going in the longer term, how they might intersect. And the first one is the extent to which the rollout of this technology is fast and messy. It already has been. And the disruption we've seen so far and the anxiety it's generated I think it's going to get worse over the next year or two. And this is a real challenge for university governance. And at its root is nothing to do with the technology itself. It's the political economy in which this technology is being pushed. So big tech firms have been in a significant economic downturn, which has after the pandemic, there was a widespread assumption within their planning that we were entering a new phase of digitalization, where a lot of work would remain online, a lot of social life would remain online, and it was a new kind of era of hegemony for them. The reality has been slightly different because they're now in a high interest rate environment, consumer spending is declining, the digital advertising market is collapsing, their stock price and profitability is falling, investors are getting angsty. For a long time, investors were willing to effectively subsidize these firms with cheap capital based on the anticipation of long-term results. And now there's been a lot more pressure for them to actually have more traditional indicators of profitability. And if these companies have been built on digital advertising or, kind of low margin online sales, then that can be quite tricky. And so there's a sense in which generative AI has been seized as the next big thing to excite markets and try and revitalize investment. And the reason I'm stressing this is, as I pointed to at the start, I think it's important that we recognize that there's a vast amount of economic power which is fixated on the rapid and consequential rollout of this technology. So Mark Zuckerberg's infamous phrase of move fast and break things has been on my mind a lot recently. And OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, talk about this in a much less direct way, but they refer to using collective intelligence to optimize the services. But in practice, this is the same thing. It's throwing the technology out into the world, throwing the system into real world context to see what problems occur, and then rely on interaction with users and responding to user responses in order to fix those problems. And the competitive dynamics mean other firms are doing the same thing. So we're already seeing a wave of products and services that are emerging. And for example, when GPT is incorporated into Office 365, we're going to have generative AI as a mundane part of working life in arguably most organizations. And that is huge. And I'd suggest that most organizations are not ready for it yet, and certainly universities aren't. And to go back to the tech firms, this is happening at a point where they are laying off large numbers of their responsible AI teams at exactly the point where the real world impacts are likely to grow. And so we have a social and economic configuration here, which is prone to generating chaos. Chaos in the wider economy and society, but also I think within organizations. And this is why how universities govern the digital becomes a really key topic. So this is something I've been working on with numerous colleagues for quite a few years now, thinking about how the platformization of the university, so the reliance of university operations on digital platforms, and how that has been intersecting with the changes in university operations during the pandemic. And there's a lot I could say here, but I guess the key thing to pull out is simply that we see a trend towards concentration. So the big cloud providers who are best equipped to capitalize on generative AI, because it requires capital, it requires data, and it requires computing power, are also the companies who provide a lot of our infrastructure within universities. So if you think about how much the University of Manchester relies upon Microsoft products, the intersection between Outlook, Office 365, and Teams, it begins to open up the ways in which there are new capabilities that come from operating within that shared ecosystem. So we're still at the early stages of exploring this, but it's something that Microsoft have been pushing in a big way. And I'm really fascinated by what happens when you put generative AI at the intersection between something like email and Teams. So if you have a meeting, the capacity to summarize that meeting and send that summary via email immediately to all the participants in that meeting. The capacity to perhaps, offer narrative summaries of all the shared documents someone has produced in Office 365 over a period of time. The capacity to summarize what happens in email exchanges between two people. There are lots of exciting affordances opened up by this, but there are also incredible capacities for surveillance, I think, that are on the cusp of being technologically possible. The fact that they are possible doesn't mean that they will be actualized within universities. But I think there is a real set of challenges here about the governance of the digital within university that have been at the periphery of academic consciousness for too long and are going to start getting really urgent. And this tendency to be locked within an ecosystem as an organization is problematic because it offers these new opportunities for surveillance. But it also creates the tendency towards lock-in. So, as we've seen when, University of Manchester, we're thinking about moving the LMS from Blackboard. This is a huge undertaking, and that's an example of the lock-in that occurs. Because if you're embedded within a particular system and the organization is built around that system, it becomes immensely time-consuming to move to a different system or set of systems. And I think we're liable to see the same kind of lock-in effects because as automation becomes a project within universities, we're going to come to be reliant upon the particular kinds of automation possible within an ecosystem. And this, I think, is very challenging. And in a way, I'm surprised that the automation of universities is not attracting more attention, because in other sectors, this is the immediate narrative that's emerging about generative AI. And so to think about automation in universities, it makes sense to think about different levels in terms of our own work, to the extent we have volitional control over it, to the extent we're talking about research and scholarship as something we have a significant degree of individual autonomy in relation to. We can already see examples of academics automating their work. These are at the moment fringe practices, but they're ones which I think will rapidly grow. So using AI systems to support literature reviews, to code data, to automate elements of writing. The software for each of these, which is being used in growing numbers. And my concern is less the automation of parts of scholarship as much as the context in which that's happening. Because when there is such an anxiety pervading academic culture and an objectively difficult job market, to use a euphemism, this creates a temptation for academics to use these services to produce more. And so this is the challenge at the heart of automation. The promise is that automation will free up our time and energy to focus on purposive, creative tasks. But in reality, it's an empirical question whether that's actually the case. And my worry is an existing tendency towards overproduction in scholarship will be exacerbated by the automation of academic research. And the possibility we're going to see new forms of descriptive audit, I think, could make this worse. Because if you think about the reasons for metrics, metrics are proxies that facilitate comparisons. And one of the reasons we rely on metrics as proxies is because qualitative comparisons of, say, 8,000 word journal articles are fundamentally very time consuming. So metricization is a way of saving time, I think, in many ways. And the generative capacities of these systems mean that we will have new forms of audit that will become possible very quickly. And I think there are interests that would drive the uptake of these. And the intersection between choices academics make about their own scholarship and the way organizations, funders, and government try and assess scholarship could, I think, be very problematic. And at the more organizational level, I genuinely think it's quite exciting. There are routine forms of paperwork and administration, which we could in principle automate and free up. As someone who spent an afternoon moving unit specifications and program specs from one template to another recently, the idea that I could press a button to do that, I think, is quite enticing. But my concern is that that's not how it will work in practice, because the promise of automation is rarely realized in those terms. The problem is that systems which are initially intended to support the organization often risk a situation in which the organization is reconfigured to make those systems work. So the processes of the university have to be readable by the generative AI systems. And what was promised to support our activity and make it more effective to free up academic staff, to free up professional services colleagues, could in fact be something that generates more work, that generates unintended consequences. And so I think we have to be very careful about this. And again, I guess a common theme throughout this is the governance of the digital within universities. It's been something that I've tried to push for a long time now, but there's still a tendency to regard the digital as a specialized question within higher education, whereas it now pervades every aspect of how universities operate. And that's going to grow with time. The fourth strand I wanted to point to is how student expectations of teaching and learning are likely to change. This is something we've seen develop since at least the pandemic, where the kinds of emergency remote provision that kept learning going during lockdown drew attention to the role of teaching staff as content producers. And the question of the extent to which academic teachers are content producers is something that's been playing out in the politics of digital learning since then. Because we have to understand the extent to which students inhabit a context in which educational content is incredibly abundant. The problem is not finding educational content, the problem is filtering it by quality. The problem is interpreting it, synthesizing it, and reflecting on it. And this is likely to grow with time because generative AI makes the production of content far cheaper, far immediate. We're going to see a glut of low quality, or at least mediocre, educational content. But we're also going to see more high quality production as well, because we're going to have a stratified market, and some firms will use the efficiency savings of these systems to improve quality and go for a premium market, premium audience. And so this raises the question of what it is we're doing and its relationship to content. And my suggestion, I'm not sure it would be a particularly contentious one, is that intellectually meaningful interaction with teaching staff becomes even more of a premium under these conditions. And this isn't just one-to-one interaction where that's possible, which raises an issue of student numbers. It's also the forms of collaborative learning, inquiry, and production between students, which individualized learners in a formal education can't get access to. And this is a consideration, I think, for distance learning provision as much as anything else. But I think there's been a flirtation within universities with a content production and delivery model of distance learning, which turns its back on a long history where distance learning was about asynchronous forms of engagement, not just disseminating content. And I think under these conditions, we need to be very careful about pedagogies that are reliant on the production and dissemination of content, because it's the interaction that's going to be really key. And so I've covered a lot of ground in a fairly short presentation. And the reason I've done that is partly selfish, because I'm getting to the end of 2 large research projects. And this is my attempt to map out what I'm going to be doing over the next few years. But I also wanted to get across how much more there is to this issue than simply assessment, which is not to downplay the questions we face around assessment, but to suggest not only is there more to this issue, we need to understand assessment in this broader context, or I suspect we'll make bad decisions about what comes next. I pointed to the economic interests that drive the hype around generative AI, but in spite of that, the analogy I'd suggest is that this is like the web, or perhaps social media. I suspect it might prove to be more consequential than either of them, but this is an epochal shift in the technology we're using. And particularly for higher education, particularly because we work with knowledge, the production, the sharing, and the mobilization of knowledge. We're in the sectors that are most hit by the longer term implications of this. And a lot of the claims made about automation are methodologically ones we should be slightly dubious of. But it does seem undoubtable that work will change. Our work will change, but the work our students will do after they graduate will change as well. In some cases, this will be new types of job. In other cases, old jobs rendered redundant. But I think much more likely is that the nature of work will change. The tasks we engage in particular jobs will change. And this means that supporting students in using these technologies in purposive, reflective ways that are literate about their restrictions, challenges, and risks is a more important capacity than ever. And we need to find ways of embedding this. And my concern at the moment is the speed at which decision-making at universities operates. because we're now seeing technological changes happening on a cycle of months. So, within universities, we were still grappling with ChatGPT 3.5 when GPT-4 with a whole new set of capacities hit. It would be a mistake to assume that rate of change will always be this fast, but I think we need to grapple with the fact that the social and technological context of knowledge is now changing far more quickly than university policy is changing, than curricula can be developed and redeveloped. And the challenge that I'm preoccupied with at the moment is how we can have more agile forms of decision-making that can keep up with that change, while also being aware of the immense risks that we face in this climate. And I think the responsibilities of universities as institutions that are custodians of knowledge to make durable, sensible, long-term decisions here. So I hope this has been helpful and it's kind of raised some interesting questions, and I'd be really keen to hear what you think or any questions you have about it. So thank you, everyone.